Hey chess friends, International Master David Pruess here for ChessDojo, and today I've set before myself a bit of a challenge. I want to try to explain a super complicated, strategically, etc., incomprehensible game, but to a sort of beginner to intermediate audience, if I can. And this is a game that I played very, very recently in a new opening variation that I was just learning, a variation which all my life I didn't understand, and which I had just studied the week before, and I was just starting to comprehend a little bit as I played the game, although not that well yet, and then more the week after when I analyzed the game for about a week. I'm going to try to keep this simple, so it's not millions of insane variations. The variations I'm going to show you are going to be not because you need to be able to calculate them. They're going to be sort of illustrative. The idea is just going to be, you don't have to be sure of every move. It's just supposed to give you a feel or an instinct or a look of what's going on. So I'm going to try and keep it simple if I can, which remains to be seen if that's going to succeed. But before we get into making something really complicated look simple, I just want to acknowledge the kind of work that went into playing this game. It was almost 2 weeks of studying the opening, tons of practice games in the opening against other people in the dojo, and then looking over the practice games again and again, of like sort of rapid games, 5, 10, 15-minute games, playing them, thinking about them, playing them, thinking about them again and again. Then finally I played this game. While I played the game, I still didn't understand the opening. Like, for example, according to my later analysis, I would play a move that was like an exclam, and then I would be sitting there on my opponent's turn and suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I should have done this other thing. The move I played was a question mark, and then once the game was done, I run and put my game in and start putting in the notes, and I put, immediately a question mark on my good move and put, I should have played this move, exclam, which is actually a question mark. So the game itself is kind of accidentally good. Like, I happen to play a lot of good moves in this game, which has something to do with the work and the effort and the study that I was putting into it, but not necessarily indicative of how well I understood the game at the time I played it myself. And then I spent, 4 hours sitting there and playing this game in sort of the full hyper concentration mode that we get during our classical OTB games. And then after that, I took the game home. I immediately wrote down, some of the things I thought during the game. And then I spent 15 to 20 hours over the course of a week going over variations in the game, analyzing it, exploring it, etc. And basically flipping and reversing a huge number of things that I thought during the game, deepening my knowledge here and there, as you'll see. Now, an introduction to this kind of modern computer age chess, which I myself am kind of at an introductory level at. I grew up in Garry Kasparov's era, and to me, my first thought of what chess was like an intense game where start to finish there's some kind of logical thread through the whole game, and you gain some kind of imbalance, advantage, some kind of thing that you could explain in words what you have, and then you push it and you grow it and you refute what the opponent tries to do against it, and they're trying to stop what you're trying to do. And there's this thread all the way through the game, and there can be like big plans, right? Like, we're sieging this weak pawn for 30 moves and then tying up the opponent's pieces there and then switching to a second weakness, like that. Modern chess has less and less big plans and more 2 to 3 move skirmishes, one thing it does have that Gary had was that it's very dynamic. You're changing from one advantage to another. That was always the thing in my own imitation of the Gary approach to chess. That was one of the hardest things for me always, was trading one advantage for another, right? Like your opponent has a weak pawn, and then you switch to like a kingside attack, and then they come to ward off the kingside attack, and all you can get is you trade a knight for a bishop, and then you switch to using the bishop pair, and then you use your bishop pair to probe and create a new weakness, and blah 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 blah. All those trade-offs, that was always what was difficult for me. Now that's happening non-stop. Every 2 to 3 moves, you're maybe switching not just what your advantage is, but your whole sort of plan for the game, and then it's switching again and again and again. So that's very challenging, difficult. It requires great flexibility in the player, and also a knowledge of a whole bunch of different plans, because if you're doing the simple grand plan, you might only need to know one technique, like occupy the weak square in front of a weak pawn, siege the pawn, attack it a bunch of times, tie the opponent's pieces down, and then capture a pawn at some point because their pieces are cross-pinned under your pressure. But now it's like you have to be able to threaten one plan, and then when they do something, you switch to a different plan, and switch to a different plan, and switch to a different plan. So in a sense, it requires an even broader understanding and knowledge of all kinds of different chess techniques. You have to be skillful in endgames and with bishop pairs and with a knight in the right position and everything. All right, so with that intro said, let's get into this game. I was white, and I was studying the King's Indian defense, and my opponent played exactly what I had been studying. And specifically, I'd been thinking about a new variation for white, new to me, not new to chess. This variation is probably reasonably popular over the last 5 to 10 years. But it's the idea of playing h3 and g4 against the King's Indian. This is an idea which, in some form, I had been exposed to, not in this move order, but in some form I'd been exposed to the idea of white playing g4 in the King's Indian as early as maybe 15 to 20 years ago, when I lost a game to Jesse Cry, the first time I ever played the King's Indian, I think, in a tournament. And he played some variation where I think he even castled kingside maybe, and played king h1, rook g1, and g4. With his king tucked in on h1. And I completely didn't understand it. I thought the king side is blacks in the King's Indian. That was my sort of default thought. For those of you who don't know, the basic King's Indian structure is usually that black plays e5 at some point, and that white pushes past. There are other structures. These are choices, but the main classic King's Indian structure is that black has this pawn chain from c7 to e5. White pushes past with d5 to take overall quite a bit of space and leave the bishop on g7 blocked. That's kind of the main structure. And then the old school pawn chain theory had been that white's going to have a pawn chain from g2 to d5 pointing in that direction and more space there. And the main plan for white is c5. And black has a pawn chain from c7 to e5. That's black's strongest pawn, and they play in that area with f5. So I always thought, the King's Indian... in the King's Indian, the king side is blacks and the queen side is whites. And then, Jesse was playing g4 against me, and I didn't understand it. I lost the game, and I looked at variations with him and verified that my position was bad. But I didn't understand it. Like, why is my position bad? Existentially, how does this make sense? In what circumstances could white play g4? How should black respond to it? Just didn't get it. And then over time, I started seeing some more variations in the King's Indian, where sometimes people play bishop e2, g4, or bishop e2, bishop g5, and then h4. And I just did not understand, what is white doing pushing pawns on the king side. So the week to 2 weeks before the game, I was sort of investigating this, and I'm going to try to explain to you h3, g4 in the King's Indian, convoluted and incomprehensible as it is. at a basic level, it's going to be taking space on the king side to dispute the fact that black has more space for their pieces there. That's the most basic level. It's also going to be saying your king's already committed to this area, and if you play f5, we're going to have the option of playing g takes f5, g takes f5, and opening up black's king along the g file. So at the most basic level, those are the two things it's saying. We're going to grab space on the king side, so the king side's not necessarily yours, and we're going to have the option of attacking your king if you fight back on the king side. Okay, so black plays e5 like in a normal King's Indian structure. And here's very important. In general, having spent this move on h3, white's almost always going to want to push past. Whether black plays c5 or e5, either one, you're generally going to want to push past and keep the center closed if you're playing this h3 move looking at g4. Why? Well, one thing, we just spent a non-developing move, so we're less pumped about opening up the position. Number two, this gives us a space advantage, and it's generally preferable in the King's Indian. Number three, if you play a normal developing move here, then black can trade and play rook e8, attacking the e-pawn. And normally to defend your e-pawn on the semi-open file, you'll need to play f3, and then you'll put every pawn on the same side of the board on light squares, which means you'll sort of only control one color square, and you'll be weak on the other color squares, the dark squares. So h3, it's a tiny little move, but it's pretty committal in that sense. It determines that white's going to want to play d5 here. Now, black can move the knight immediately, looking for f5. Or they could play like in the game to first post this knight on a good square on c5 to put some pressure on white's e-pawn, and just to, you know, have a piece on a good square. Sometimes that's helpful in chess, right? To have one or more of your pieces on good squares. So black plays knight a6, headed to c5. And when I first saw this variation, I thought, then we just, play g4. They're not even close to ready to play f5, yay. But after black plays knight c5, it's a little awkward how we want to defend this pawn. Putting the bishop on d3, we're committed to defending the bishop and offering black the option to take the bishop pair if they ever want it. Queen c2 also moves the queen away from supporting these squares quite early. So a better move against knight a6, I believe, and I figured out, is to play bishop e3, as I did in this game. And then when black plays knight c5, you can defend the pawn on e4 with knight d2 without trapping your bishop on c1. Now this bishop is both well placed and poorly placed. It stops black from playing bishop h6, controls this diagonal. You can trade off this knight in certain circumstances. Often it's terrible to take the knight, often it's great. It changes so dramatically between the moves people play, whether or not you want to. So forget about the old ideas of like, this is my good bishop, this is a good knight or a bad knight, so I should trade it or I shouldn't trade it. There's absolutely no absolute about this possible trade. It can go from brilliant to terrible, god-awful, boneheaded, dumbest positional decision you could make. Because these positions can vary so much. Anyway, the bishop can get harassed by f5, f4. The move h3 has a stop knight g4. In a lot of other cases in the King's Indian, if you play bishop e3, black harasses you with knight g4. The reason being that if you spend time saving your bishop, it's giving black time to play f5 very conveniently while you're moving your bishop more than once as white. Okay, so I defend the e4 pawn, and black is going to play a5. It protects the knight from the move b4. So we establish a square. Right? So that was just a little mini operation from black. They established a good square for the knight. And now it's hard for white to start a traditional queenside space grab with a3, b4, and c5. But in any case, here we're going to play g4, grabbing that space on the king side. And now black has a choice between moving the knight and just confronting white immediately with the f-pawn, or developing the pieces more like in this game where black's going to play bishop d7 to get out of the way of the rooks, and c6 to introduce some tension elsewhere on the board. And either could be playable, but I recall seeing Qa6 show this idea that if black retreats the knight before you even go h4 and g5 and takes the pressure off of g4, instead of pushing g5, Qa6 played h4 with the pawn still here, and then put his bishop on h3. And this bishop, which is often a not very strong piece for white, look at the pawn structure a moment ago, see all these pawns on light squares. And sometimes we defend the structure even further with f3. This bishop, which is normally not that good a piece, Qa6 was able to put it on h3, fight for the f5 square and the e6 square, and trading black's really good bishop. And is a very, very strong idea for white. So my first thought currently would be, as black to play sort of similar to Tirard here with bishop d7, just doing some coordinating. Now, if white goes g5, black can just play knight h5. That stops any h4, h5 attack. It makes it pretty easy to play f6 for black, trade this pawn, open up the rook, find a little more space for the bishop and queen. And black's knight can hop into here at some point later in the game, so it's well positioned. So I would say g5 is just a huge mistake here against knight h5. But if we want to play h4, we'd be hanging the pawn on g4. So I was obligated to put my bishop here on e2. Not a great square, but it just defends the pawn to allow me to continue advancing these pawns, which is kind of the plan here. I think black played c6, introducing tension here. Now, if black starts trying to play f5, white's going to do something which I didn't have any opportunity to do in the game, which is white's going to play maybe queen c2 and castle queenside, and then h4, h5, and you just blow open the king side, and the move f5 is only going to help white to checkmate black at that point. So if we just play, a move like that, queen here, f5, how best to do it? Because again, there's this f4 threat from black. I think, well, we have to trade this g pawn, otherwise that pawn's going to get away from us. And if we castle queenside, black's going to have the option of f4. We won't lose a piece. We'll make the trade we have to. And then play bishop g4. That looks good enough. Okay, so I don't want to make it too complicated, but I'm going to just castle queenside here for white. And say that next move, if black did nothing, white would be putting a rook on g1, or maybe even playing f4 to explode this whole side of the board themselves. And black would be in trouble. So here you would expect black to do this. Now we make the bishop trade, which I said is often terrible, and follow up with bishop g4. We trade off these bishops, leave this bishop pretty bad, and we have the g file to put pressure on, and the idea of trying to maneuver our knights to these outpost squares at some point when the bishops are gone. Or just to put them on d3 and f3 and pressure black's pawns. So that would probably be really strong for white in my opinion. So this move c6 for black, it does allow white to open up the queen side now, right? Because there's pawn tension on the queen side, and the queen side is white's and the king's Indian. But what it's really doing is it's strongly discouraging us from castling queen side, because black's ready to play, b5 as well at some point, and open up a lot of lines against our king if we go there. Now, if we wanted to switch to playing on the queen side, saying, oh, now we can open the queen side, you've played c6, let's use our space advantage there, where would our king go? That's kind of the issue, right? Because right here with these pawns like this, it's not yet a beautiful moment to just castle kingside. For the moment, it seems scary to put our king over there. So for now, oddly, white can't really figure out where to go with the king. We continue the plan of g5, pushing the knight back and grabbing space, and then we even just keep pushing these pawns. White is oddly in a bit of a hurry to get this pawn to h5. Once the pawn comes to h5, you have the option of h takes g6 to open the rook for certain attacking purposes or weakening their king. maybe even without an immediate attack, but just the possibilities of attack. And you also have the possibility of h6. And imagine a bishop on h8 right now for black with white pawns on g5 and h6. How many squares would that bishop have available? How much would it be able to move, that bishop on h8? Kind of nothing, right? So you can sometimes trap black's bishop on h8. That's a very important extra plan or oomph for white in this opening. So we rush the pawn here and don't yet decide about the king. Black grabs more space here with a4, which is going to help attack the queenside if I go this way. I could still at some point play queen c2 and castle queenside, and during the game I remember I still wanted to up till this point. I was still hoping, playing these moves that black would not continue the queenside attack while I was doing this, and then I would play queen c2 and get castled and be able to coordinate both rooks on the king side. But my opponent played a4. I wanted to mention, if they fight back against white's space with f6, looking to make room for these pieces, white would play h5 here and takes. And in a sense, if black takes with the h pawn, it's a pawn sack because black has an extra doubled pawn. Black can also play h6, blocking the file and try to collect this pawn later, but it's actually very hard for them to collect it. They can only attack it with a queen or rook here, and we have bishop h5. Here's a very hard to understand position as well, very hard to evaluate, etc. Just very, very confusing. But basically white has some access to black's weak light squares and lots of plans for attacking the black king from here. So the position proves to be pretty good for white. And if black plays f6 in general, weakening the g6 square a little bit, the ideal for white is to play h5 and take this pawn and just go for as many pawn trades as possible. If black's going to make a pawn trade, we want to trade all the pawns so the king's really exposed at that point. And black's not going to be playing f5, f4 in this case if we're trading a bunch of pawns, so white won't be cramped out of the king side by a black pawn on f4. We'll have access to go attack at some point. Really confusing, right? Trying to evaluate so many different scenarios. So black plays a4, as I said, gaining space over there. And I just kept rushing the pawn, which it looks like white is a beginner. When I first saw these variations for white, I thought it makes no sense spending so much time on these pawns. But now we're in touch with this pawn, so any f6 we can take, and any f5 we can play h6. So let me explain the difference. So f6 we take and open the king. Because f6, they're going to trade this and we can't trap the bishop. But f5, they can no longer ever play f6. Then we go h6 and we trap the bishop. The bishop is dead. So now we're not attacking the king, right? We locked up the whole king side, no attack. We spent, 5 pawn moves on the king side, and we're not going to attack that area. All we're doing is trapping this bishop, and then we're going to actually probably bring our king to the king side that's locked and attack on the queen side, c file and b3, b4 at some point to open up more of the queen side and try to win with the extra piece on the queen side. So it's very important to have the pawn here so we've got both of these options, and then it really constrains black's options. Black, it would be very nice to move this rook to have options of going bishop f8 and not getting the bishop trapped. But for now, after queen a5 in the game, if white plays h6, black can just go back and then play f6, trade one pawn, bust the bishop out. And you'll see that here g6 is decently defended, so the king won't get attacked so badly. So f6 is a viable plan, and therefore h6 is too soon by white. Too soon. We're waiting to see if black goes f6 or f5. We have to choose the right option for white. Okay, queen a5 introduces the idea of a3, undermining the knight. And if I really still wanted to castle queenside, I had to play queen c2 here. And I thought a really long while about this. And finally, I figured out I really needed to stop this move a3 and just play a3 myself. But this makes my pawn structure on the queenside so brittle that basically I've given up on castling queenside. Because black's always going to be able to open up that whole area of the board, right? They've got b5 and then even b4. And the king just can't live on the queenside now. So where is this king going to go? That is the perplexing conundrum for white in this case. And black continues untangling their pieces with knight c7. And now they're one move away from having all the pieces untangled, bishop having access to avoid the trap, and lots of pieces on the queen side and maybe a plan of b5 and opening up the queen side. Despite the queen side being white's and the king's Indian, it's white's because white has more space, so normally they've got more pieces there. But black's managed to bring an insane number of pieces into the small part of the queen side that's theirs. And if you've got more pieces, you can fight there, even if white has space. Important factor though, because black was so cramped, the only square for the knight was, over this way, the only square for the queen here, the rook coming that way, that's going to leave no pieces around the black king, and that encourages white to try for a kingside attack if black brings everything away. So here I played this brilliant move, king f1, and I'm going to try to explain this move. So if you castle and commit your king all the way over here and don't have a rook to help you on the king side, then black can play, let's see, f6 or f5. If f5 would trap that bishop, so let's say f6. And now HG doesn't help you as much without a rook here. Black's going to open the king side, and your king is going to be a bit vulnerable, and you're just going to be a little bit slower to get your rooks and queens over to the king side. Black has chances, fun, exciting, messy, wild game. Okay, but you also can't go queenside, and also right now white can almost move nothing. It's a strange near Zugzwang for white despite their space. I originally thought that the idea and plan in such a position would be to play bishop g4. You trade off black's good bishop for your bad bishop, right, because of these pawns. And you make space to transfer your queen to g4 and then mating attack, right? Does that make sense? Okay, this is very helpful by black, maybe, but you see how this would be sort of ingredients for a mating attack, right? Now, some people might say, hey, it's not quite enough. You need one or two more pieces. You need one more piece to finish. But these are the ingredients of a mating attack. We can see that was sort of my basic understanding of what the plan would be. But I found more and more that this plan generally didn't work because of knight d3 check. And either black takes on b2 and white's position falls apart quickly with counterplay, or the knight comes and plops on f4 and just disrupts our attacking potential. So I found more and more that the move knight d3 check was a real problem. In addition to that, black can probably play the move f5 with the tempo on the bishop and just try to explode things here. So I first thought of the idea of king f1 just as sort of a tempo thing, right? Just to be able to play bishop g4 and not have knight d3 hit me with the same instant tactical force. But by the time this game was played, I'd found out that king f1 and bishop g4 from my sparring games is not good either. Black gets too much counterplay on d3 with knight d3, even without the check, and just in general coming into the light squares in the center. And it was no longer clear to me how much do I want to trade my bad bishop. And I was finally starting to move towards the realization of something that I only truly realized when analyzing the game, but I did do it correctly in this game, which is that the most useful thing white can do in this position is move this king to g2 without castling. That's the thing to do in this position. Now, why? We leave the rook here so that we've got force against the king side. And by getting our king off of the first rank, we allow our three heavy pieces to coordinate, two rooks and queen. That's not normally how you coordinate your rooks and queens in chess, right? Normally, you castle and then you put your queen on the second rank, like c2, d2, e2, something like that. so your rooks can move back and forth, protect each other, go to open files, etc. Here, our open line of communication is going to be the second rank. I don't even want to play queen c2. It brings my queen away from the king side, right? So queen c2 to get out of the way of the rooks would be bad for my queen. But the king is just going to walk out of the way here to g2, and that's going to coordinate white's rooks and queens. And then white can figure out what's the next appropriate plan. Will it be opening the king side, opening the queen side, locking the king side, locking the queen side? It's mysterious. So I go king f1. And now my opponent traded on d5. And what I want to say is if they go rook c8, they can save their bishop from being trapped. King g2, and there's no h6, bishop h8 plan anymore because the bishop can always go to f8. But now look at black's pieces on this side of the board. Who's protecting this king? Basically nobody, and white's just going to go for a flash attack, a very, very basic flash attack, where the queen just transfers into h2. Powerful. And if black plays a move that sort of musters a potential defense, then I found that often you would want to lead with a rook, not your queen. So you go like here, here, here. Do you see an attack taking shape? Suddenly out of this weird amorphous chaos of the modern chess, you see a good old slam bang, triple your heavy pieces on an open H file, checkmate the king. It looks like a, like a Fischer Yugoslav attack against the dragon or something, right? H4, H5, open the H file, sack, sack, mate. Here we might not even need to sack as white, right? We're just gonna capture the H7 pawn more or less. Now black's got counterplay with taking and b5 and stuff, but it's just going to be way too slow now, right? Because we waited so long to commit to the attack. Black's counterplay can't be as fast as queen h2, rook h1, rook takes h7 anymore. So that's what happens if black really just evacuates every piece, as white can then try to attack the king suddenly, even though it looks like there's not many white pieces on the king side. And if you didn't want to commit to this move, if you wanted more improving moves, so I would play king g2, bishop f8. If you don't want to trade yet, although trading's really good here, this is another nice move to wait and hold on. You support your center, you make way for pieces to transfer underneath, you control this g4 square against any strays. It's nice for your rook to be in front of your king, and you're still preparing that checkmating attack. So in the game, my opponent played another plan that I hadn't seen before. He traded, and then went for trading some pieces, actually, which was very, very confusing to me. I mainly thought that he was going to go for a plan like b5, b4. I would just keep shuffling my king. Important detail is that against b4, white has knight c4, kicking the queen, and suddenly it's back to, the queen side is white's with a million pieces pressuring there and space advantage and everything. Sorry, I put the queen on maybe the wrong square. Maybe here's a little bit better, but the bishop's defending this. White's just going to push everybody back from the queen side for black. So black would need another move like knight a6, so that against knight c4 you could put the queen on c7 and your knight would defend the b pawn. And what should white do if against this b4 plan? I think go for a kingside attack, either rook h4 or queen g1 h2 now. And let's just say like queen g1, b4, takes. White's going to have some attacking potential here. Even after hg, there are attacking ideas here on the H file. But black's also creating counterplay. So interesting, and that's kind of what I expected was b5, looking to open here. My opponent plays knight b5, and now I'm shocked. Remember, just a week before in my development, of understanding. It was like white wants to play bishop g4 to trade this bishop. Now my opponent's spending energy, right? In theory, they're trying to trade that bishop themselves, right? Wow, what is going on? Wants to trade this bishop themselves. And then I started seeing like, oh man, black's queen's going to come to b5, taking light squares. The knight's going to come into d3, or the queen could come into d3. And wait a minute, whose light squares are weak, black's or mine? What is going on with this chess? And then being a maximalist, I wanted to play a move like rook c1, so that if black takes, they're bringing my rook to the c file. And then they can play bishop b5. But look how much energy they're spending, right? They go knight b5, they go knight c3. Their moves disappear with the trade, right? Then they go bishop b5. Meanwhile, I'm bringing out the rook. When they go bishop b5, I'm not going to trade and bring their queen there, right? I'm going to have them go here and trade and put my queen on the light squares. And then I'm dominating. That's what I wanted to do. But as I mentioned in the intro, chess is all these little mini plans and switches in structure. It looks like this move is aimed at trading these pieces and going after the light squares. But if white plays this maximizing move, black just switches it up and goes after the dark squares now, plops the knight into d4, taking a ridiculous number of squares under control from me. And if I ever take this piece, black unleashes the dark squared bishop as a beast. And suddenly, my pieces are kind of in weird disarray. I can't capture this pawn. This piece that was a bad piece is good. And my king is weirdly placed, and black's ready to go f6 or f5 and just blow open the king side. Now, previously I'd said that, f6, hg, and the king's too weak. But it's all about, different scenarios. And here, this knight is getting shunted somewhere like a2 or b1. And suddenly we can see black's pieces are more active than white's pieces. And so black can afford to play f6 and open up this area and fight with both kings exposed, right? In other cases, I was putting my king on g2 and trading on g6 to open the king side for an attack, even though my king was there. That was based on there being more active white pieces in the area. So, what trades we want, who wants to open up the position or keep it closed, those factors are changing on a move-by-move basis based on who had to retreat one piece or who got one piece to a more active square, etc. So I realized that knight d4 is just going to be very, very strong for black, and so I had to trade this piece. But now, of course, I didn't want to spend time trading and bringing their queen here. And in this position, I played the move I mentioned that I thought was a question mark, but really it's an exclam, the best, brilliantest move, king g2. After the game, I thought it was a blunder because I gave black time to bring out the rook and avoid getting the bishop trapped, right? But if they go rook to c8, then I think white can switch to h takes g6 and attack black's king on the h file. So I would say like takes, takes, and here. With a kingside attack. So let's go here for a moment. So the move that I really wanted to play that I thought would be an exclam was h6 here. But then when I analyzed the game later, it turned out that in this position specifically, let's say, well, we have to deal with this and the d3 square. So let's say, I don't know, I play king g2 like in the game, but with h6 played. That's probably what I would have wanted to try and do. Black can go knight d3, threatening knight f4, make me trade. And now what you see is the black queen and bishop are immediately in good position on the queen side with rook c8 to fight for this file. Black's going to get to the file quickly, and if we trade a bunch of pieces, then they're going to feel safe playing f6 to dig their bishop out. It won't be trapped forever because they always have f6. So the advantage is not that impressive. So actually I play king g2 first, which is better, even though it lets the bishop escape the trap. It's keeping open these two options flexibly for one more move. My opponent really wanted control of the light squares. So I think they played a small error here with queen a6. And if it's an error, what would I recommend instead? Based on what I've sort of learned about this opening, maybe actually rook a to c8 might be what I would recommend now. Between rook a c8 and rook f c8 would be a reasonable choice. Also, f5 itself might be a little complicated. There's not a strategic answer, actually. Like, no matter how much you learn it, because it was me thinking that I'd learned it, thinking, oh, now I play h6 before the bishop can go there and trap the bishop, and why didn't I play h6? As I'd played king g2, I sat there thinking like, oh, I should have just played h6 before the bishop can get away. It depends on calculations, It depends on calculations every time, whether f5 is going to give black enough counterplay if the bishop gets trapped or not. And also whether or not this f4 move, how it gets answered, right? So, with probably have to play bishop h8 first, but then there will be the question of whether f4 is a threat or not in the resulting position, whether black has queen d8 to attack this pawn. It's so specific, so I can't actually say just off memory what black should do against king g2. If I were in this position, despite all the analysis I've done, I would have to just recalculate a whole bunch of lines and find the answer concretely. And that's what makes this kind of chess so difficult now, I think, and favors so much people who are both good calculators and have a good breadth of knowledge of different plans and themes and ideas. Because you have to be willing to switch your plan completely between f6, f5, rook c8, knight d3, queen a6. You have to be able to switch your plan completely based on little calculations that tell you what's better or worse in that position. Queen a6 is a little bit clear that this move isn't so good because it gives me a tempo here. I trade it. And now I have enough time that I can go h6 and trap this bishop. I'm playing for the trap of the bishop. Black's gonna have f6, so I've committed now before the rook could come out next. So now I need to be ready for f6. And h6 could have been a terrible move or a good move. We trap the bishop, but if we don't have a good way to get ready for black playing f6, this is actually going to be terrible. The other thing to watch out for is knight d3, knight f4, cutting off the defense of this pawn, and then you have to be ready to defend the g pawn if black attacks it with the knight already transferred to f4. So in this position, the natural move to me was rook c1. Another move to consider would have been like queen f1, trying to contest light squares, or queen c2, similar. And I kept finding knight d3 annoying, and finally I came up with the idea of playing this super wimpy move that's actually a great move, which is I trade off that knight before it can get going. And I give up my great bishop. We give up the great bishop. The knight was also a good piece. Now g5 is undefended. f4 is really weak. The king, generally you have to be very careful of the squares around him. But what this is going to do is, first of all, if black plays like this, we've got a protected passer and there's a lack of energy or dynamism in the center. Not much that's going to open up here. So structurally that's very unfavorable for black. And if black goes queen c5 like in the game, we get a tempo to start improving our rooks. And if black plays f6, fighting to open the f file and the bishop, it's going to be very important for white to have their rooks able to make threats from the side at c7 or c8. So getting a jump on taking over this file is critical to this whole h6 move being strong here and black not being able to get out with f6. But it's even more specific than that, because black goes queen d4, and this queen's amazing here in the center. And if I didn't have a good move now, this might also be tough, because the queen's keeping my knight from moving, because it's busy defending this pawn. It's threatening b2. It's taking it, you know, it could come to d3. f6 is coming. There's pressure against f2. So this queen's really hard to deal with. And here there was an excellent move for white, rook to h3, controlling d3 where the queen could get away. But the key point of this move, number one point, is that it overprotects this a3 pawn. Now, in this position, if white did something absolutely random, like, you know, king g1, something stupid, and black took this pawn, you have the move knight c4. Beautiful move, right? You defend the a pawn, you're on a great square, you kick the queen, and then you take d6 with a structural advantage, right? We pass this pawn on d5. So it doesn't look like black can play queen b2 knight c4 here, but I also needed to get the queen out of this square, and to do so I felt I needed to, well, one option would be to play rook c4. But once you play rook c4, black can consider queen b2 because you don't have knight c4. So what I came up with was rook h3, and the point is that after almost any move, I think black played f6, so we could just put that move on the board and show the idea. I can go rook c4 hitting the queen. Queen takes b2. That's the move we worry about. Of course, the queen in the game went backwards because this doesn't work. And now rook b4. And this is where the a pawn needs to be defended. And the c3 square needs to be defended. The queen can't get out of here. She can only go to a2. And then after knight c4, she's trapped. She just can't get back to the rest of her pieces. And so, well, maybe I have to watch out for f takes g5 before I do that. But f6 was a controversial move. I just wanted to show that white can create a trap around the queen here. Okay, here I probably have to do something about f6, like maybe queen g4 threatening queen e6, f5, and then queen back to d1, and then play for knight c4 next when the queen can't get out. Yeah, I'm not sure, but the point is that this is covering all these third-rank squares. It also can come to g3 to defend the g5 pawn if we need to, and it can sort of block checks for the king. So this rook lift, that's really the move that justified h6 and bishop takes c5, was to have this follow-up here, dealing with the queen. Black played f6 to bust out the bishop. It's kind of the only strategic choice here for black, so not too much to say about it. Once white's committed to h6, then it becomes more clear what you want to do. You want to trade these pawns and get the bishop out. And you need to do it soon in this case. Well, there's two ways to do it. One way is if you've got control, if you can get control of the c file, take control of the c file first and then play f6 at your leisure. But if white's got the jump on the c file, you need to play f6 before white gets a rook to c7 or whatever. Because then they're going to start being like checkmating attacks against your king while the bishop's taking away your only flight square. And I got busted a couple times in practice games as black here, playing f6 and then, you know, white attacking my king while I didn't have a flight square on h8. So f6 right away, critical, chase her back she goes, and now queen g4. So the point is that if black takes here, we've got check, and of course the bishop's no longer trapped, but the king is sort of trapped, and black just can't defend the king position, I think, against white sort of encroaching from every direction here with the rooks. And the king gets mated. Trapped in by his own bishop and forced into this pin. So queen g4. Black could consider rook e8 here, which wasn't the choice in the game. I think I was thinking of rook f3 in that case, with the idea that if black takes now, I might have just rook f8. This rook can't move because of queen e6, king f8, rook c8, and white's queen comes into d7. And the bishop technically can get out to f6, but it's just not fast enough. Black gets gets totally tied up in a position like this, right? Like here, we can go, I don't know, something like this. Switch what the pawn is doing to queening. And that's like an issue in an endgame even. I don't know if that's the most beautiful. But yeah, I was going to go rook f3, and the point is I'm getting in rook c8 and maybe queen d7 or queen e6. So the bishop can start trying to get out, but it's still a clumsy piece, right? Because I didn't even take the pawn on g5. It's a somewhat clumsy piece. The h6 pawn's taking away annoying squares, and the queen can't get back because white's rook and queen are already cutting off the transfer squares, kind of. So black played f5 to box the white queen out from here. And now the absolutely shocking transition in the game, I take. Why does white do this? The bishop's fully trapped now that f5's been played, right? I could just, back up my queen and say this bishop's trapped. Well, what I thought in the game was that black would play queen d8 attacking the pawn. The only move I really saw to defend it was rook g3 defending it, and then f4 kicking my rook, and then rook has to go to g4 to keep the pawn defended. And I looked at this position, I said, I've trapped the bishop, but isn't my rook almost trapped too? Like, to hold on to the pawn that's trapping the bishop, my rook is sort of stuck here. And am I using a rook to trap a bishop? How do I win the fight for the c file now? I mean, my knight's a good piece, but I rejected this situation here off of the concrete difficulty of defending the g pawn against queen d8. And that's the cost of this bishop, one of the costs of this bishop takes c5 move, but also just how concrete it is. Because this is the dream. Queen g4, the thread here, getting black to play f5. Now the bishop's done. You should be able to just back off with the queen and say, that's it. Bishop's done. Now we go, rook c3, and we just win the game on the queen side while that bishop can't move. But no, I thought that queen d8, just on its own, refutes the whole grand plan. And that's why in this modern chess, there's no grand plan. Right? So I take on f5. It's a weird switcheroo. It's trying to keep open the options of directly attacking this king. So there's two different ways black could play it. In the game black took with the g pawn, let me just show you one thing with the rook. We would go here and try and trade the rook. We're trying to get to e6. The rook can't even, The square is very, very hard for black to defend. Again, if black's queen were just sitting around on d7 or e7, this wouldn't be the plan for white, because e6 would be defended. White's plan would have to be something completely different. But here, it's very hard for black to cover e6. I have to go rook here, I guess. We take, and now they're forced to play g takes f like in the game, because against rook f5, there's just rook c8. Right? And if the king comes up, you're losing this bishop. It dies in the corner. And if the rook comes back, it's mate in one. So we just trade, and this rook can't continue defending the f file and the 8th rank, and so they're forced to do this. And we play queen h5, and we go for this mating attack with g6. So we're going to completely let this bishop out of its trap. These pawns are super strong. If given enough time, black can play e4 and f4, and the bishop and rook become amazing. But there's just a very, very strong attack coming here with g6. And let me show you just one fancy variation for fun to give you a sense of just how willing you have to be to trade one thing for another. This is the move that is the hardest to calculate in a game, so it's the most concerning move. I mean, strategically speaking, the move queen d8 also makes sense, just trying to bring defensive resources towards the king. And then after g6, trying to trap the bishop. With this move, you got to go bishop f6, and white can, well, there's 2 or 3 different things white can do here. But one simple one I'll just tell you is queen f5, regaining access to e6, and white's ahead of pawn now. So I think there's an even better variation, but at least this we can see that it's good for white, right? against the simple queen retreat. So the move that's harder from a human perspective, even if it's worse, to calculate is queen a5 attacking all our stuff. That makes us nervous in a game, right? When we know that one wrong move could cause us to lose the game. You don't feel comfortable gradually winning when any move might lose the winning position. And here the move is g6. So completing our undoing of our own plan and untrapping that bishop, right? We put everything into trapping it. Now it can come out. There is a checkmate attack brewing, and if black takes the knight, for example, we can take, check, coming from the c file, and, well, let's do a pawn mate for fun. Don't worry about being able to calculate all that. If you feel like this position is chaotic and confusing and there's no general reason to think that white is winning, you're correct. And I'm not going to dispel that with like a variational proof of white having a good position, nor am I saying white would always have a good position here. You know, one little detail different, you know, maybe the f pawn on f3 so that there's checks on the second rank, and white might be losing or equal instead of winning. I am trying to say it's chaotic and it's based on a lot of calculation. Now, you might be feeling, anyone who's not confident in their calculation or, you know, more of a beginner, you might be feeling, well, I can never play like this because I'll be hanging stuff. But you can, because your opponent will be hanging stuff too. I don't play this position well enough. You know, if I were playing against somebody better than me, they would outcalculate me and beat me with white or with black. But I don't need that permission to play this, that I'm like the greatest chess player in the world. I can just play and explore whatever I want at whatever level I'm at. Okay, so all the stuff is hanging. Cool. I mean, that's fine. You'll win some games and lose some games. So g6, so black saves the bishop from the trap, right? And now the idea was, well, with g6 we trade the pawns and we open up the king, right? But now we have to switch what our advantage is again as white, and we go g7, leaving the king locked up. But the bishop's out, the rook's out. I'm going to move the rook to d8 to free it up. Queen takes f5. Now we're threatening queen e6 checkmate because the king's kind of trapped in by the pawn. So weirdly enough, we haven't opened the king up, but he's got so few squares that these pawns aren't a good shelter for him. He's actually under great threat of mate. So now it comes time where he's got to go queen into the center, take the pawn with check to defend this. Knight e4, sacking the rook. If queen takes rook, knight f6 check will be winning. And here black has an interesting tactical try. Bishop takes g7. That's releasing black from mate if this pawn goes here. So potentially if white took, black could now take the rook, and knight f6 check isn't mate because the king, there are now no pawns around him, right? And after this, there's like a checkmating continuation from white, but again, it's just trading off every single thing we had. It's just rook c7. So we gave up trapping the bishop in order to open the position. Then we gave up opening the position to put the pawn on g7 and trap the king. Then we give up the pawn on g7 to go back to opening the position and checkmating like this. In the final position, white's down material. None of black's pieces are trapped. The center is collapsed. The king is open, but black is checkmated, because we're threatening rook g7, and if the bishop moves, queen h7. And to me, this illustrates just like the speed at which we're trading things off. I mean, look at this variation again. After f5, we trade, giving up the fact that this bishop is blocked because there's always e4 now, right? Rook takes, we trade the piece, fixing black's structure, bring the queen here, just going for g6 to open the king. Black attacks all our hanging stuff. We go to open the king. The bishop saves itself from being trapped by g7. No, never mind, we're not trading the h7 pawn or opening the king. If our rook had access to c7, if black had taken one of these pieces too soon, then we would take on h7 and rook c7 with mate. But here we don't have access to rook c7. We switch it up again. We go g7, chase the rook away, grab a pawn. Threat of queen e6 forces decisive action from black. They break our structure. We give it up and just switch to the c file. And generally when you're penetrating on a file, it's in order to attack things along the rank once you get into the 6th, 7th, or 8th rank with your rook, and that's the case here as well. To me, the speed at which you're changing what your goal is every 1 to 2 moves is dizzying. But remember, again, that not only you, but also your opponents will be dizzy if you want to try playing such crazy stuff. So my opponent took with the g-pawn. I played queen h5. And yeah, the plan is g6, opening up the king and letting the bishop out. Because in any case, if I go slow here, black will be able to play e4 and get the bishop out anyway. Black fights back by attacking these two hanging things. And now there's no going back, right? Our king is exposed. Their bishop can be saved. Everything's just ragtag and just pure calculation. g6, threatening g7, but also if they take the knight, specifically, we switch to checkmating if we ever get this key square for our rook. So black holds off on whether they want to take the knight or the pawn and saves the bishop first in the game. And I forget how good g7 was or wasn't in this position. I would have to calculate it again to tell you, which would extend this video by an extra 20 minutes that I would have to sit here calculating to double check if g7 wins. But in the game, I played a move that's very winning. And in general in chess, when you see a move that's very winning, you are better served to double check it than to look for a second way to win and maybe miss a defense in each variation. So I took here, and the threat is queen e6, king h8, g7. So that's how you mate against queen takes knight. The king's trapped, rook's attacked, so they have to sack this back. And then you can checkmate the king here, a basic destruction of the defenses. This is where it's good to know a bunch of checkmating patterns, right? This phase here. They'll help you out in this kind of a phase of a game. So my opponent took on d5 to cover queen e6. Here I made my worst move of the game, I think, with rook f3. It was the least winning of any move here. Knight e4 is best, but you can move the king to any legal square and it's also winning very easily. I don't know what my weird instinct was with pinning my own rook, but it was a terrible move, but white's still winning. But the move is bad enough that it gives black a little bit of a defensive chance with pawn takes g6, queen g6, king h8. Normally here you'd try to win with rook c7 going for checkmate on h7. Even if you hang your queen, it's all very specific. If you checkmate them, it's fine that your queen is busted. But here black has queen g8 saving the game. And white might be slightly better in the endgame, but it goes to an endgame. That stops the checkmate and trades the queens. If you have your rook on h3 in this position, you can always go rook g7. Let me show you by putting it on the board for you, right? If we played a move like king here, then this move is basically never possible for black because we go for the checkmate, rook g8 mate, and queen g8, rook g7. Splat. And this only works because it's double check, so they're not allowed to play queen takes pawn. The king would still be in check. So it's double check and checkmate. And that is, yeah. That is why rook f3 is very bad here, is because it does let black play h takes g6, and then to win in this position, you need something fancier for white. I think it's rook. You have to go rook g4, queen f7, and then rook f6, which is tricky and hard to find. It's a funky tactic because what are we doing? What we're doing is We removed the bishop that was covering the square. It's not checkmate, but it does win us that rook, and then we play with the knight against rook, or with the extra knight in the endgame. So rook f3. Yeah, black can sort of defend like this, but played rook e8. Well, sort of. Black could extend the game. Rook e8, and now it's getting easy. We play knight e4, threatening knight takes bishop with checkmate. If the bishop ever goes away like this to open up the rook, then basically we can take here and creep towards checkmate on g7 with the pawn covering rook to g8. And let's say black goes rook g8 anyway, sacking a rook to stop checkmate. Sort of the only idea that's very interesting. And then goes here trying to win your queen. If you take, you've got two rooks against a queen, but there is a completely winning tactical idea for white here. And it's typical for this whole position, but it's also, it's not guaranteed that it's there. You just have to calculate all the time. Some stuff like this, it's using the C file, right? We get in here, and if the rook takes, we have checkmate. And the rook can't take the queen because it's pinned, and basically white's just going to checkmate in a moment or two here with queen g7. So, it's very specific what we have to do about everything. Black played rook e6. And unfortunately, I was being very practical. I saw a winning move and I calculated it and won, and then just double checked it. And I had maybe 7 or 8 minutes, and I spent 4 or 5 minutes just double, triple, quadruple checking, because once you see checkmate, or winning a queen or a rook or that sort of a thing, that's going to win you the game. You don't need any time left beyond that. So I just double checked and I didn't look for anything else, and so I didn't get to play the most beautiful variation, but I played something pretty nice. I played knight takes f6 check. If the king moves over, there's g7 mate, and after rook takes f6, white has queen takes rook. And there's a bunch of things hanging, but there's too many checkmates. If black takes this rook, there's checkmate on g7 or f8. If black takes the queen, there's back rank checkmate. These pawns here that were supposed to smother the bishop, they end up smothering the king, right? We make an artificial back rank mate, even though black has almost no pawns themselves in front of the king. Checkmate. It has to be that rook because the other one can't even move. Yeah, so that was a very nice way to end the game. However, if I were Alexander Alyekhin, I would probably correct the score after the game and make queen f6 the last move of the game, because it is even much more lovely to sack the queen to both rooks like this. Again, black can't take the rook because there's checkmate on g7 or f8. If they take this way, there's back rank mate after they block once or twice. That's nice. And if they take this way, you have knight f6 check, and this is absolutely forced mate. If the rook comes up, it's the same back rank mate from the game. And if the king goes into the corner, keeping the 8th rank defended, I would say that's a fairly pretty checkmate. So yeah, if I hadn't been so practical and focused on winning the game, if I'd been more artsy and just sort of messing around, I might have noticed queen f6 here, but that's modern chess. It's very concrete, and you're just working very specifically all the time. You have to marshal your time. You have to decide when to think. In this game, one thing I did was on every positional decision, once I'd been thinking for 10 minutes, I just made the move that I want, the best move that my instinct told me at that point, instead of continuing to consider it, even when I didn't know. And that saved me time to do more calculations along the way, little 3-4 minute calculations. And also at the end to do a couple bigger calculations when I was deciding was like the biggest decisions? Maybe after I played G6, yeah, maybe around here playing G6, allowing Queen D5 and Queen D2. Maybe around here is where I did some of my biggest calculations, and I had some time on the clock to do it. So that is my attempt at giving an accessible introduction and sense of what modern chess is like. And when you see these games that 2700s are playing, obviously they're playing better than this, but I think this is a lot of what's going on, is they're just concretely looking at what are my opportunities in the next 2 to 3 moves, struggling over things, and just so quickly switching between plans, ready to play an IQP, ready to play a bishop pair, ready to play an endgame, ready to play this or that or the other, and things just changing dynamically so quickly. You can rarely settle into a big plan, One of the few examples I saw recently of a game where it looked like there was a big plan was a game from the women's candidates tournament in the first round between Lei Tingjie and Tan Zhongyi, who are still tied for first place in that tournament, so a really huge game. And Lei Tingjie successfully executed the minority attack in the exchange Queen's Gambit, and she had that weakness on c6 that she'd traded, and the open c-file to pressure it, and her queen had got into the dark squares, queen c5, queen a5, and the queen side looked like it's eventually going to crumble. And Tan Zhongyi just threw some dynamic threats concretely, move by move, towards Lei's king on the king side, and eventually the game flipped around in the calculations and variations, and black won the game by winning a pawn and then grinding out the end game, even though the big picture story was that black was slowly losing. So that's so much for the grand plans, right? Even when you achieve it and everything goes right, a modern player is still just finding little concrete this and that ways to fight, and that's what the games are like. So when you look at the games and you're interpreting their moves, you can't put them into the context of these instinctive broad strokes, right? Like, this is the good bishop, so we're trading it. No, it's the good bishop right now for these 2 moves, and so we're trying to eliminate it right now. But, if it retreats or if the opponent makes an active move with threats, we might just switch up that plan and do something else. All right, let's continue this discussion in the comments section if you like. I imagine this kind of confusing. If it feels completely confusing and hopeless, I'm sorry. But it feels like, yeah, maybe I can get it. I've got 1 or 2 more questions. Hit me up. I'll do my best to answer questions and explain further. And yeah. This is a really cool game, but what I was trying to do was sort of give you some sense of the feeling of these weird games that to me have always looked incomprehensible and still often do, and how hard it is to understand and explain what's going on and how concrete it all is. So hopefully that gives you a flavor and it's interesting. You don't have to understand all the details or be able to calculate all the lines, but now you sort of know what's going on, what's at stake maybe. And I will close by encouraging you for a 3rd time that you can play like this, even if you don't have any calculational skills. Go for it. You'll develop your calculation skills, and your opponents will be hanging pieces right and left, as well as you hanging pieces right and left, and that's how we get better. It's not by shirking various positions because of fears of our weaknesses or inadequacies. We have to go headfirst into those positions to develop. Now, I'm not saying you have to do this. Everyone can play their own chess. You can play whatever style you want, but feel welcome to do it, okay? This gatekeeper is telling you the gate is open. Even if you're a beginner and you like the eval bar, and you don't calculate on your own, go for it. You have my blessing to play the Najdorf, the King's Indian, the whatever opening. What opening is good for beginners, David? Anything. Play whatever you want. Play whatever style you want. Play complicated games, simple games. Play the London system. Whatever makes you happy and interested and engaged in the game. It's all cool. All right. Have a good one. and mind that gate.